So first of all, welcome all of you, all the participants, and a special thanks to my dear friend, Dr. Javed Wani, who has kindly agreed for the first colloquium presentation. And let me have a brief discussion on why exactly we have this kind of session. We are here mostly with people who who have been attending and participating in the activities of CSPS for the last 1 year. And I hope that most of us have this understanding that the CSPS is trying to evolve a new, some new intellectual space in India for the researchers of social sciences who can ask some difficult questions, some pertinent questions, important questions, new questions, and can have new kind of inquiries in their social researches. And in this effort, we are trying to promote, to support, especially the young researchers who are trying to become, are trying to join the social sciences. And of course, the career of social sciences is not that much encourageable in India, and it's not that much easy thing for many to do. But still, there are many people who are trying to join academia, and they have quite perceptive and intelligent minds. So they would like to dedicate their intellect in asking these tough questions. So what we have thought that there are many good people who are really very serious in their intellectual pursuits, and they really miss that kind of space that would help them in having a good understanding and evolving their own understanding of many issues. So what we thought is that apart from our general activities, of which many of the activities are for even general audiences, undergrad students, master students also, and open for all, basically. So why don't we start a program, a discussion in which we can invite only specific people, selected audience with to discuss something which one of our friends in this group is going to produce or has already produced on any theme. So any of us, especially among the friends of CSPS who are writing some books or going to produce a paper, a research paper, or they are preparing for some really new idea. So we would like to invite them, and we would like to ask them to share their ideas with this selected audience, and so that they can ask more questions and they can get a real good feedback, so that there can be an exchange of ideas between the two sides, the author, the prospective author, the person who is going to write a book or chapter or a research paper can find here a very rich audience who can really give them the best possible feedback in all ways, be it in theoretical aspects, be it in methodological aspects, or maybe in other discursive issues. So here we are trying to evolve that kind of a close group of young intellectuals with whom we can evolve a very enriching environment. What CSPS is going to achieve from these discussions? Of course, the benefit is for the author and for the audience. The CSPS would like to have to benefit from these intellectual discussions, so that CSPS can also encourage new ideas and new discussions on many untouched themes. And our young researchers at CSPS would like to take some cues from these topics, and they sometimes they can find a subject for their PhD, sometimes they can find a subject for their term papers. Sometimes they can quote these papers in their works. And of course, they can be motivated to do more intellectual activities in their academic and personal lives. So this is going to be a forum where we all are going to benefit immensely. And it is going to be very fair, very honest session, very honest forum, where we will have quite frank discussion on the subject of which we decide every time. So with this frankness, we will appreciate the hard work of the author, his commitment to research methodologies, his commitment to the idea, his commitment to his own academic sincerity. And of course, the audience is also going to benefit a lot from there. And of course, with Javed Wani and his upcoming book from Cambridge University Press, in which he is going to discuss all of these issues, he has a lot of things for our intellectual provocation. So he is going to offer a lot of questions, a lot of discussions, and of course, very deep theoretical debates about his own understanding of the society and politics in contemporary India. So it is one of the best opportunities that we are going to learn a lot, and we are going to question a lot, and we are going to exchange our thoughts in a very frank manner. So I really appreciate all of you for taking time to join this session. And I really thank my dear friend Javed to have some time for this session. And I believe that we are going to have a quite enriching and wonderful session in the next 45 minutes, 1 hour. So thank you very much. Over to you, Javed.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Umair Anas, for this kind introduction, and also for sort of marketing my upcoming work. It's at the proofreading stage at the moment with the publisher, in the production stage, and probably should be out by the end of the year or early 2023. Yeah. So anyways, good evening once again, everyone. Before I begin my paper, let me thank the Center for the Study of Plural Societies for organizing this colloquium. I'm feeling a lot of pressure being the first speaker for this initiative, but you got to do what you do. So I chose to speak on the theme because I believe it has some important insights to offer vis-a-vis the history of early 20th century India. So thank you, CSPS, for giving me the opportunity to share my research with this at this platform. The title of my paper is Communalism, Labor and Law in Late Colonial Bombay. But what this paper, or maybe let's not call it a paper, this set of ideas I'm proposing here, will precisely do what it will do is that it will discuss the figure of Mawali, or the hooligan, in the city of Bombay, and the utilization of such a, what I call in my research, a problem category by the provincial government to justify extraordinary measures impacting public life. And, you know, during the course of my presentation, as you will get to know the case that I'll be discussing, you will realize that the story, even in 2022, is not quite different. And that's where it becomes interesting. And while doing this, there's something that I've become recently interested in when I'm doing like legal history. I'll also invite you to think about, which I haven't done sufficiently yet, but let's do this together during this conversation. What I would also like to invite you to think about is the concept of neighborhood in the colonial city in early 20th century India. And we can explore the neighborhood as a site of encounters, conflicts, and exchanges of various kinds. In addition to various floating dichotomies of colonial urban history, where frameworks of fragmentation versus encounter are available, frameworks of agency versus coercion are available, coexistence versus conflict, all of this is already available in the scholarship. I would like to propose that neighborhood, being ambivalent in its character, right, could be more useful. And neighborhood in the colonial city at the same time, I would propose, was fragile, sometimes tense, and therefore is a very productive lens to look at how the colonial city was organized. Now, I'm a historian, but I learn a lot from other disciplines, particularly anthropology. And that's why, for me also, devil is in the details. So the closer you look at a story, the more precisely you follow up each instance, things begin to kind of unravel in front of you, and you begin to understand the nitty-gritty of why something would have happened and what would it all mean. So this particular discussion is kind of located in the late 1930s in colonial India, in the city of Bombay. The context is the introduction of the Government of India Act 1935. And then immediately after the 1935 Act came into existence, the provincial elections in colonial India were announced, and the elections took place in 1937. Now, the colonial government, at that point of time, through this Government of India Act 1935, aimed at increasing Indian participation in provincial governments. That's what its claim was. However, the contours of politics, guided by concerns of different religious communities, became sharper also at this moment. The Congress Party, which was a major nationalist party, it was able to form governments in many provinces after the 37 elections, including in the Bombay province. Now, in this paper, I will show that the provincial governments led by Indians, particularly, when they came to power and took control of the governments, provincial governments, they resorted to repression as a significant tool to deal with the political unrest that was the reality of public life at that point of time. Now, the paper that I'm going to discuss with you, the issue is a communal conflict that took place in the city of Bombay in the year 1938. And the confrontation is typical between Hindus and Muslims. And this confrontation flared into large-scale violence, which we call a riot. Even in the eyes of law, it is defined as a riot. Now, during this riot, and then riots, because it didn't stop at one moment, it kind of escalated. The Home Minister of the provincial government in Bombay invoked a combination of laws like Section 144 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, and he also instituted curfews to control the situation. As a result, hundreds of inhabitants of the city, they were arrested. What I want to do in this conversation is threefold. Firstly, through this example, I wish to highlight how religious communal conflict in the late colonial period would often begin, apparently, over trivial issues, but escalate into large-scale riots influenced by meta-political concerns. Second, I would like to show that how moments of quote-unquote disorder facilitated administrative urge to institute extraordinary laws like Section 144 and curfews. And finally, I want to propose that the invocation of these extraordinary laws was justified by the administration in reference to what is a continuous theme in colonial governance, which is the presence of a problem category. And in this case, the problem category becomes the figure of the Mawali, or the hooligan in the city of Bombay. Now, on 17th of April 1938, at around 6 p.m., a group of men had gathered to play cards in the Northbrook Gardens in the city of Bombay. The game was disrupted due to a disagreement. Some members of the group, they fell out and had a heated argument. And soon a crowd gathered in the garden. The otherwise insignificant disagreement during the game of cards erupted into a fight and quickly escalated into a scene of full-blown violence. A police force had to be rushed from the nearby Mahar Bavri police station to intervene and to stop this clash. The situation remained calm for the next couple of hours before erupting again. Now, within 3 hours, a minor incident during a game of cards had become a communal incident. According to newspaper reports, groups of men belonging to two different religious identities began to clash, challenged the police, and resorted to vandalism. The police also resorted to firing at multiple occasions, and in the end, a curfew was imposed by the city administration at the behest of the then Home Minister K.M. Munshi, who was a senior leader of the Congress party. Now, for Munshi, public order could only be restored if an extraordinary law was created or brought in to deal with these mawalis and hooligans who he thought were responsible for this spectacular violence, aka riots. Now, the city of Bombay, if you look at this urban space, especially in the colonial context, it had a growing number of casual workers because of the setup of industry, being a port city, because of the influx of migrant labor, presence of a large number of casual laborers. Now, given the nature of their employment, these casual workers, they would resort to playing cards in parks while waiting for new job opportunities. And on that fateful day, 17th of April, 1938, it was a usual evening in Bombay when the clashes began. Soon, these groups of men who were mostly workers gathered in the garden, and these men were later referred to as hooligans or mawalis in the newspaper reports. Now, I want to kind of bring in a few concepts that historians and cultural theorists have discussed at length in their work. For example, Ranajit Guha. And Ranajit Guha has discussed the currency of rumor, the concept of rumor, as a significant trigger and mobilizer in colonial India. And rumor still remains an important concept even in contemporary India. So for Guha, rumor played an important role in mobilizing peasants, for example. That was the context of his study. The unique strengths of rumor as a tool enumerated by Guha are the anonymity of the source of a rumor, its capacity to build solidarity among unconnected masses, and an embedded urge in it that prompts its recipients to pass it on to the others. Right? The rumor doesn't stop. It continues in cycles. The colonial administration saw, for example, peasant insurgencies fueled by rumors as instances of peasant rationality. Now, Guha further argues that rumor had a function that reflected a code of what he calls political thinking, a means of spreading the unwritten dispatch of revolt or dissatisfaction. Now, based on Guha's analysis, another famous and controversial scholar, Homi K. Bhava, has also skillfully pointed out two aspects of rumor. He says there is an enunciative aspect and then there is a performative aspect. And Bhava has identified that the intersubjective communal adhesiveness lies in the enunciative aspect of the rumor, while its contiguous spreading belongs to its performative aspect. And these two aspects of rumors, it can be argued, were also at work in other contexts. For example, during communal riots. And this example that I shared with you is an example that fits very well with this kind of analysis. Now, media is also very important in terms of, how it kind of deals with an event. And here I'm referring to the riot as an event. Now, newspaper like the pro-British Times of India and the pro-Congress Bombay Chronicle, they reported this general, quote unquote, scene of violence in Bombay in very, very detail. Yeah? So, according to the reports, agitated crowds violently confronted each other. The initial altercation over the game of cards had now become a full-blown riot, quote unquote riot, because it was presented as a riot, and it was spreading to other localities too. And the riot gained an unimaginable momentum in a short time, leading to a brutal display of violence on the street. And within half an hour of the commencement of the clashes, over 25 people were taken to the JJ hospital in Bombay. And the assaults, this conflict began at 6 p.m. and the assaults continued until 10 p.m. that night, resulting in more and more people being taken to the hospital. And the police, an interesting institution, failed to effectively control riots and had the sense that the situation was getting out of control. It subsequently set up pickets at all strategic points. The police did not always command authority, it seems, over angry crowds, and upon failure, resorted to repressive measures like lathi charge and firing, precisely because it cannot control these huge number of protesters. Now, sensing that the situation was spinning out of control, the police fired shots on various occasions during these clashes to disperse the crowd. And it was only then in these cases that the police were able to save their own lives. Now, so many people were stabbed in these clashes. To increase the ambit of administrative authority in such a context, the provincial government responded with a combination of extraordinary measures like Section 144, as I already said, combined with the invocation of the Indian Arms Act and the curfew to subdue these clashes. Typical. Now, during the clashes, K.M. Munshi, the then Home Minister, sensed the scale of impeding administrative crisis and had to cut short his visit to the south of Bombay Presidency. He immediately visited the riot-affected areas, took stock of the situation, and held an urgent meeting at the police headquarters. After the deliberations at the meeting, the Chief Presidency Magistrate, Mr. Khandalawala, issued orders under Section 144 prohibiting any gatherings of 5 or more people and the carrying of lethal weapons. Now, lethal weapons is also an interesting category here. What qualifies as a lethal weapon in such times is also the subject of discussion. And a curfew was also installed between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. for the next 14 days. The calculation of this time is very interesting, that how do you calculate that a clash would subside or a conflict would reduce? So this invocation for 14 days is very interesting here. And the Congress ministry here resorted to colonial legislation that just before the election, it itself was ostensibly opposed to. So simultaneously, the provincial government also served restrictive orders on several vernacular newspapers like Khilafat-e-Roznama, Insaf, Prabhat, Al-Hilal, and Sadaqat, and warned them against publishing anything that might inflame the religious susceptibilities of the people. However, they were also allowed to or permitted to publish news and articles if they sought approval of the Director of Information. And this shows us, vis-a-vis media, that the vernacular press was publishing views that were distinct from the English press, right? That's why restrictions were put on the vernacular press and not on the English press. Like the police, the English newspapers kept reporting the agitated crowds as a quote-unquote mob. If you look at such kind of a reportage, it does accomplish a wider political work. Anthropologists have argued that the media are often crucial mediators of state acts. In this case, at least, the English newspapers graphically reported the instances of violence. They enabled the newly elected provincial Congress government to argue for stricter measures, substantiate its authoritative policy, and reiterate its commitment to the security of the citizens and the maintenance of public order and tranquility, a theme which is very significant to this paper. Newspapers such as the Bombay Chronicle or the Times of India aimed at creating a political consensus, which was often punctured or confronted by the vernacular press by raising particular issues that concerned specific religious communities. It is unclear as to why the vernacular press had to be regulated if it were the hooligans or the Mawalis who were responsible for the mayhem. Now, the detail in which the English newspapers explain the display of violence across localities highlights that the idea of community, place, and space was central to the idea of such large-scale riots. And the city of Bombay, if you look at its history, it sharply evolved between the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Famous historian of Bombay, Jim Masellos, in his various work, has pointed out this evolution and is outlined the spatial order of the city, highlighting strongly defined series of templates. There's an imperial and a functional template of the city, which demarcated the place of ruling power and the places of economic activity. In addition to the racial distinction between the European and the Indian part of the city, the Indian part had internal divisions based on region, caste, and religion. Most importantly, as Masellos has observed in his various works, the Muslim areas were preponderantly Muslim. He has argued that the city as a territory was constructed as a series of mental maps for its inhabitants and coexisted or superimposed upon one upon the other, diversely and severely perceived according to person, location, and time. Now, Masellos identified at least two sets of templates, one related to urban form and the other related to the perception of space from an experienced interior. The template of the urban form provided the distinction between the British town and the Indian, and it was based on the opposition perceived by the British. Now, as the Indian part of the city grew further in the early 20th century and the influx of migrants increased, the functions located in the Indian town grew by imperial fiat, but also haphazardly over time. Some areas were established or expanded either by municipal edicts or by wealthy Indian entrepreneurs. So, if you look at the kind of these various internal divisions within the Indian town, the concept of locality or neighborhood remained a dominant feature of urban space, where it held a specific identity distinct from other neighborhoods in the Indian town. A locality comprised of gullies, wadas, wadis, chawls, bazaar, and muhalla. While the term bazaar was used to denote a marketplace highlighting its distinctive locality, muhalla, scholars have noted, was especially or specifically used for Muslim locality. Wadi, bazaar, and muhalla came to be the most commonly used references for localities in Bombay. Now let's move on to the figure of the Mawali or the hooligan or the Badmash. Now, in the meantime, after instituting Section 144 curfews and the Indian Arms Act, the police began strenuous efforts to round up these Badmashis or the Mawalis. And the newspapers on the following day reported in a very reassuring tone, might I say, which is quite similar to the administration, that the greatest safeguard of all has been the arrest of over 400 men on suspicion of being what can be described as Badmashis or Mawalis, who were, it was said, and I'm quoting, carefully handpicked by police during the day and were to be detained for 14 days at least. Many of them, according to police, had knives, sticks, or lethal weapons in their possession. Now, some scholars have suggested that Mawali was the other of the working class and could be equated with the lumpen proletariat. Gangadhar Adhikari, for example, in the explication of Marathi translation of the Communist Manifesto, characterized Mawali as a class below the working class, who were destitute and lived in the city's slums. It is not difficult to ascertain that most of these so-called Mawalis were the lowest of the working classes, and also because they were casual labor. So one can draw that connection, not in the regular work, out of work quite often. So after the passing of this Government of India Act 1935 and the introduction of this provincial politics, the political climate in Bombay was particularly confrontational between the Congress and the Muslim League, for example. The colonial state had always avoided the imminent politics around such events and rather found it convenient to mark problem categories as the root of the disorder. In Bombay, for example, the Congress government did not change the colonial perspective and adopted, I would argue, the time-tested colonial tactic of identifying problem categories in the form of hooligans, mawalis, to be blamed for this public order and violence. And even after the introduction of this controlled decolonization, I would call it, this Government of India Act 35 and this 1937 provincial elections, the provincial Congress government continued to argue for extraordinary laws and emphasized and replenished its monopoly over legitimate violence. However, this could not be achieved by blaming or confronting the entire population, right? Now, the Indians have become part and parcel of the provincial government. Hence, some individuals or groups were marked as problem categories. The extraordinary laws, it was argued, were to be directed at the selected few. But in reality, as we know, they could be applied to anybody. That's the potential of these laws. So a problem category here refers to a group of or individuals who were identified by the colonial administration as a threat to peaceful governance and the maintenance of public order. A significant number of writings have pointed out that individuals and groups were frequently marked and defined as criminals of one type or another, and therefore made repression naturally available to the colonial state. And scholarship on Thuggy, mutineers, revolutionary groups, Gunda, the rowdy sheeter, continues this discussion. The point I'm trying to kind of highlight here is that even though there were provisions available within the criminal law that were aimed at habitual offenders, for example, in colonial cities, the provincial government felt thoroughly justified to legislate a new law when it identified the Mawali or the hooligan as the new problem category in the city of Bombay. Now, I want to take this discussion forward by contributing to this discussion on what is referred to here as problem category. Mawalis were primarily the casual workforce crowding the city of Bombay, who lived precariously, had diverse socio-political loyalties, and a distinct sense of belongingness across various parts of the city. And provincial elections impacted the way the precarious inhabitants interacted within the city, right? So now I want to kind of, come to the discussion of the law. So these people are arrested, these 400 men and some women also got detained for the violation of different kinds of law. So after the riot, the state machinery swung into action and followed a familiar drill. The Commissioner of Police visited all the disturbed localities, took stock of the arrangements to enforce curfew. Individuals were arrested, even if they unknowingly or innocently violated the curfew. For example, there was a rule that, or order that everybody had to be indoors by 10 p.m. Otherwise, they would be arrested if they were seen on the streets. By 19th of April, in 2 days, headlines began reporting that the situation was under control. And the number of deaths and wounded and all of that was being reported. And most of these arrested ones, almost 400 initially, but then later the number grew to 2,500. So they were referred to by the police as bad characters, and some who were just arrested for disobeying curfew orders. Now, over 500 persons of these were arrested either on the suspicion of being involved in the clashes or for the breach of chief presidency magistrate's orders. All of the arrested were placed before 2 judges, Oscar H. Brown and W.K. Mankar. Now, some of the arrested were allowed bail while others were sent to jail. And a huge number of people arrested for the defiance of curfew orders were the ones who got late either from work or could not reach home before the curfew. Now, the magistrates were strict while dealing with these cases. For example, a man was arrested by the Commissioner of Police himself for defying curfew orders at the Abdul Rahman Street. And this person's lawyer pointed out that, and I'm quoting, there was a misunderstanding that led to the arrest of his client. And the magistrate replied sternly that, and he says, the misunderstanding is all on your side. The judge, in a way, made it clear that during a threat to public order, any assessment of a situation by the administration was reasonable. 4 men arrested for defying curfew, they wanted to make a speech or a representation in front of the judge about their innocence. But the magistrate interrupted them and responded that, and I'm quoting again, he says, your speeches are all very well in normal times. And pay attention to this word, normal times. But these are abnormal times, and your place is everywhere. The reference to time and place by the magistrate is significant here. In the instances of a threat to public order, especially when the administration had instituted a curfew, the permission to be present in a public place was restricted, and therefore extraordinary provision such as curfew created a peculiar fracture between the public and the private. In one of the cases, there was a woman who arrived from Delhi carrying a sword stick, and she was also arrested by the police for defying the Indian Arms Act and presented before the magistrate. And her lawyer pleaded with the judge that she bought the stick at Mathura station because she fancied it and was ignorant of the law. And the magistrate observed that he will allow bail to her just because she was a woman. Otherwise, she would have been sternly punished. In many such cases, some accused were remanded to jail custody for a fortnight, while others were allowed bail of 500 rupees with a surety of 200 rupees to be deposited. Some managed to get bail on lesser amounts also. Now, what is interesting here in terms of law is that different persons arrested under the purview of the same set of laws had varied outcomes. Persons with resources could access liberty by furnishing bail amount, whereas the underprivileged had no option but to languish in lockups for a longer period. In total, if you look at the archives and the official records, some 2,500 persons were arrested for defying one or the other order, right? Now, I want to move to this discussion about decolonization and this reconfiguration of late colonial state. Now, scholars have argued that it is quite doubtful whether an evocative Hindu or Muslim identity actually existed before the 19th century. Investigating communities on a broader basis emerged, some have argued, in the 19th century because large-scale conflicts between religious identities began under colonial rule. To most of extent, not in all cases. Communalism as an analytical category did emerge during British colonial rule. And I'm saying as an analytical category, because various kinds of social strife were labeled as religious due to the Orientalist assumption, which understood religion as the fundamental divisive factor in the Indian society. Right? And if you read Gyanendra Pandey's construction of communalism in colonial North India, he's also making a similar argument. Now, such an Orientalist preconception did not dissipate with time. Spectacular displays of violence, and here communal violence, were often addressed as issues of public order in the records of the colonial state. The term public and order at once achieve a symbiotic objective which rested on the ability of the state to claim a monopoly over the use of legitimate violence or force and deploy coercion. Simultaneously, the state also conducted and controlled the discourse about this, right? Both the public and the order. David Gilmartin, for example, has noted that the term public could be understood in at least 3 ways. First, as public policy, when it refers directly to the state. Second, as public opinion, when it refers to the community as distinct from the state. And third, as public sphere, when it refers to the arena between the state and the society, or sometimes also community. So in times of public disorder or a crisis of public order, the state resorted to all these 3 definitions of public simultaneously, I would say. Public peace and tranquility at once became the objective of public policy. A narrow and specific narrative is then offered to the citizens with the help of mass media as the only legitimate perspective, and hence the public sphere is argued to be a space of harmony mediated by law. It aims to enable a consensus between the state and society with the broader objective of achieving efficient and effective governance. However, the notion of a monolithic public also requires some introspection. And introspection could begin by trying to understand as to how society challenged the dominant narrative of the state. Thomas Brome Hansen has observed, for example, that in cases of spectacular violence by the public, there is an assumed moral force of violence. Others too have argued that collective violence should not be treated as a departure from the political, but should be analyzed as a heightened and intensified continuation of normal politics. Here, violence is seen as a form of definitive action that seeks to gain attention or generate recognition. The narrative of the state competes with a peculiar or sometimes popular moral narrative, and the state responds by unleashing its coercive apparatus and argues for the protection of freedoms, which are seen as endangered by the non-state violence. For example, labor riots or communal riots in the colonial time. Therefore, a strategy of domination is argued as nothing less than a necessity. As a result, freedom is all but eradicated. Curfews and other extraordinary legislations are important in this regard. The state tends to reduce this narrative of public order to a single model of unidimensional determination of power that in turn tends to either constrain or productively modify the political and moral meaning of various acts. For example, Bart Clem and Bert Soikens, they have recently argued that the politics of order and disturbance must be conceptually evaluated through a combined study of public authority and de facto sovereignty. And de facto sovereignty here concerns with the existence of obedience and control. So colonial administration's account, if you look at administration's account of the entire episode, the colonial administration, that's noteworthy. For example, in a confidential letter to Lord Linlithgow, who was the Viceroy and Governor General of India, Roger Lumley, who was the governor of Bombay at that point of time, appreciated the measures taken by the Congress ministry. Now look at this. The colonial master is celebrating the way in which the newly elected Congress government is operating. And Lumley appreciated the measures taken by this Congress ministry and termed them as prompt and effective, and expressed that K.M. Munshi, the then Home Minister and the Congress leader, deserved considerable credit for his efforts to deal with the riots. And he revealed that even though the Commissioner of Police, the Secretary of the Home Department, and the Governor were away from Bombay, Munshi shouldered the entire responsibility for containing the situation himself and set the police arrangements for the situation working at once, quickly instituted a curfew order, promulgated Section 144, and forbade the carrying of weapons. Now, Munshi's strategy anticipated decolonization, where a Congress minister acted by himself to use a notorious colonial preventive legislation. It shows that the colonial state was quite successful in normalizing its administrative strategy of calculated repression to the Congress ministers. Munshi acted exactly like a British administrator by instantly making large-scale arrests, instituting a curfew, and branded unruly mobs as hooligans and mawalis. And he adopted a familiar colonial strategy that turned violence on the streets into law. And the bygone repressive measures of the Bombay Police Act 1902 that identified and expelled bad characters from the city were now to be brought back by a similar stringent law. And the bill to tackle mawalis and badmashis was introduced on 25th of April 1938 and was passed in its third reading on 29th of April. Look at the swiftness with which the law was passed. And these unusual 7 days required to, the usual 7 days required to complete the process was waived off in this matter in the name of emergency, right? And the riots in Bombay, what they did was, these particular riots, they provided the administration with an opportunity to make a case for extraordinary legislation and emphasize the urgency of empowering police to either outlaw or let's call them deport individuals from the city in this spirit of maintaining public order. The Bombay administration, and especially the Congress ministry, sought to replenish its power by resorting to legislate extraordinary laws that aimed to create the image of an authoritative government. However, it exposed its administrative vulnerabilities of the colonial administrators and the Congress ministries. So, Lumley, this governor, did not believe that the outbreak of riot could be put down solely to this card playing incident. He believed that the main cause was the growing tension amongst the Muslims due to the propaganda of the Muslim League that Muslims were in danger of being swamped by Congress. And therefore, Munshi had much more on his mind than merely controlling the immediate situation. Lumley observed that Munshi had taken the opportunity provided by the situation to introduce the bill to restore the power of the police to deport undesirable elements from the city. And powers of such nature existed in the Bombay Police Act just a couple of years earlier, but they were rendered inoperative by a decision of the Bombay High Court then. Now, Lumley believed that the power to deport bad characters who congregated in Bombay was an important weapon for helping to preserve the peace of the city. Bad characters, badmashis, and mawalis were used interchangeably to denote individuals who posed a challenge or were perceived as a threat to public order and governance in the city. And if you look at, if you pay attention to this Sladen's letter, he had also observed that many perceived the bill as reactionary within the government, giving excessive powers to the executive. But the government managed to pass the bill almost unchanged by the House. There's a lot of discussion. I don't want to bore you with the detail. We can discuss that. But what we see is that Munshi responded to the riots and is being celebrated as an able administrator by the colonial administration, and the Congress did not incorporate the suggestions made by the trade union members. Now, Munshi assured the leaders that workers' politics in Bombay will not bear the brunt of the new legislation, but the dominant narrative failed to notice that it was the diffused nature of the labor force in Bombay that did not allow a rigid definition of a working class. And all of these people who were now blamed for being mawalis and hooligans and bad characters were actually these casual laborers who were waiting for the next job, for the next gig to be available, to become available to them so that they can sustain themselves in the city. Now, I don't want to get into this discussion about, historical discussion about the figure of the labor in the colonial city. Let me move towards, what is significant here is that the new law that Munshi kind of, swiftly brought in, what it enabled was the repression of multiple targets that was seen as a challenge to urban public order. Migrant laborers from United Provinces, Bengal, Hyderabad, and nearby Konkani region served in formal as well as informal labor sector in the city, both in the factories and outside the factory. Now, the law to control Mawalis was aimed at these inhabitants who now fought raucous battles in the streets, not only for labor rights, but community rights as well, as Hindus and Muslims as their identities. Now, the unrestricted powers to maintain public peace and tranquility were once again concentrated in the hands of the commissioner and his deputies, and it enabled them to declare persons as mawalis, hooligans, and badmashis, further enabling the autocratic tendencies present in the late colonial administration. Now, this delinquent figure, this problem category of the hooligan or the mawali, resonates with that of the vagabond, whose status as a criminal emerges from the lack of a firm identity in the community. The non-belonging of the mawali, it can be argued, was based on the lack of his exact location in the immediate society that put him outside the established system of responsibility accrued by defined crimes. A mawali stood outside society, threatening it with both individualized as well as collective authorized violence, and thus was perceived as the enemy of the state and society. The category of the mawali led to an evasion of thinking about crime more in terms of very specific or very particular transgression, which was the original stated intention of the Code of Criminal Procedure. Resorting to extraordinary laws citing a threat to public order opened the way for a sociological takeover of persons or groups, enabling a possibility of heterogeneous outcomes. The provincial ministries, even before the arrival of independence, had comfortably adapted the colonial administrative strategy of repression. Munshi's course of action, to conclude, Munshi's course of action is very similar to the British colonial administrators, whose perspective or whose imagination stemmed from an urge to act against crime as acting against degeneration. And the colonial administration saw the emergence of this criminogenic situation as the object of government, right? The creation of yet another extraordinary law to tackle this particular problem category of mawalis was both judicial and extrajudicial at the same time. It was commanded by the principle of universal justice, but was simultaneously informed by a sense of constant surveillance based on an understanding of surveillance as observing, controlling, and intervening in the details of social life. Now, large-scale riots did not just establish a staging for collective action, I would argue, but constituted this collective action. Riots should not be seen merely as weakening or abolition of administrative power, but a theater of power. Collective action like riots managed to reconstitute power in the hands of administrators who would expand the ambit of law much beyond the actual rioters. Colonial administration, while responding to disturbances, did not just repress the riot or riots, it continued it in the form of penal practices and general everyday activities of law. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Javed sir. It was so fascinating that I personally would have wanted to continue for few more hours even. But I think that I should immediately open the forum for question and answers from our friends. So please raise your hands.
Thank you for a very illuminating talk, actually, because you are bringing in a number of important factors, how the production of the hooligan and how this question of labor and criminality that is brought together in a very inextricable manner in the legal endeavors of the time by this so-called forced decolonization effort that you were mentioning. If you can throw some light on how this was criminality and the class of people, how it was connected to community as such, because that connection, how was it being brought out so that this perpetuation of that extraordinary provisions could continue much later in the post-colonial situation as well. But how was this being made? Some more aspect about it would make things much clearer, I think. The other one is just about the whole question on rumor. That because in all these cases, whether it's criminality or the lumpen proletariat, everywhere there is that that subnormal kind of entities. And rumor is a practice which also fuses with that kind of an abnormality and the subnormality in that sense. So somewhere how this, the aspect of rumor, the enunciation of rumor that you mentioned, how that part, is it being produced in these circles of people of, or is it enunciated at another level altogether? Where does it come from? It's at the performative level, maybe it's much wider in scope. But how are these rumors produced and spread at that point of time? These are just for expanding some of the things that you have mentioned. Thank you very much. I enjoyed the talk.
Thank you, Professor Ramakrishnan.
Yes, Javed, to you.
Can we take a few more and then I can kind of...
Yes, why not?
Thanks, Dr. Javed, for this is really fascinating talk. Just for my own informations, I would like to request that, do you find any kind of similarities of this kind of violence in other colonial cities like Calcutta, where the growth of jute industry and the labor politics in Calcutta? I mean, do you find any such, is there any studies which basically if not compare, but at least we'll get some understanding of labor politics and the communalizations of labor politics in that point of time.
Sure. Thank you. Mateen, right. Thank you for your comment. And, I also, again, very recently published another article. It has come out in Labor History. It's the porosity of labor politics in colonial Calcutta. You might want to take a look at that. And, particularly the works of Shubha Basu, Soumita Sen, Dipesh Chakrabarti, and there's Parimal Ghosh, if I'm remembering correctly. These are the ones who deal with this notion of labor, city, precarity, communal violence, all of this. And then, of course, what's his name? I'm forgetting the name of the historian. Shugata Nandi has published one article on the Gunda Act in colonial cities. So it's in the Crime Histories and Societies Journal on the Gunda. So you might just want to take a look at that also.
Great. Thank you. And your article is in that South Asian journal, right?
No, the Bombay one is in South Asia. The Calcutta one is in Labor History. That the name of the journal is Labor History. Yeah.
Super. I'll look into. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. So, are there any more questions, or shall I kind of talk about?
Yes, go ahead.
Concerns raised about Professor Ramakrishnan. So, in terms of, if you look at labor and criminality, what I in my paper call Janus-faced challenge to public order. And if you look at this culmination of multiple aspects of politics in this context in late colonial Bombay, it resulted in an overlap of otherwise distinct issues of class, community, and problem category. Particularly during and after these elections of 1937 and the contestation that it ushered in, what it did was it blurred the boundaries of community and class, right? And expectation and experience also of citizenship, this colonized person. Now, it initiated a redrawing of structures of power, boundaries of localities, and space, mediating both individual and community interaction and belonging in the city. Now, earlier Congress was against the colonial government, somehow flirting with labor unions also, now they are on the control and authority side. Okay, the worker, which was earlier seen as a working class, suddenly because of this contestation between Congress and Muslim League, has also acquired this identity of being a Muslim and a Hindu, and there are these anxieties that so the religious side does not die with the class identity, so it remains there. It's part of this anxiety, as community anxiety, still there, and so that there's a division also within the lumpen proletariat, or within the proletariat itself, within the labor itself. Now the localities earlier, which were just working class localities, has suddenly become Hindu localities and Muslim localities, right? So, so in terms of if you look at Professor Ramakrishnan, and you must be aware of this. I'm sure I'm just repeating this. This Royal Commission on Indian Labor, the report that was published in 1929, it had observed very precisely, this commission report, the unruly laborer in Bombay, and termed this unruly laborer as an agriculturist who was not a disciplined one. These are the terms: unruly, agriculturist, and not a disciplined one are worth noting. Now, this became the basis of a series of labor laws enacted between 1911 and 1936. And this saw the arrival of this, what in history is known as modern history, we call it the modern labor subject. And the introduction, for example, of the Prevention of Intimidation Bill in 1929 is one example, right? So the laborers cannot get together, intimidate the factory management and all of that. There is laws waiting for them, repression. So if you look at this very interesting scholar, late scholar, basically one of the best of his kind, Rajanarayan Chandravarkar, and he has thoroughly demolished the assumptions that the development of labor politics in Bombay can be best understood in the light of existing models of an early factory labor force, because that's what Royal Commission wants us to see it as, right? He argued that in the context of Bombay, it is not correct to portray a labor force as if it is in a nascent stage of the formation, when in Bombay it had already been in existence for about half a century by 1918, right? When this report is published. So even at that point in time, 50 years had already passed when the labor force in this factory was already set up in Bombay. Now, Chandrawaka pointed out that the agencies of the control imagined, defined, and responded to issues of order in a way that involved violent repression. And the workers, they were actively making their own politics. Examining the context in which workers lived outside the workplace, and here, people who are familiar with labor would recall, Rancière, his critique of a kind of Marxism who only looks at life of labor in the factory, but the laborer, and he argues for the continuation of the life of the laborer outside and after the works of the factory, into the neighborhood, into the slum, into the workers' quarters. The life. That's where Rancière would say that the workers sit together at night, despite being tired, and organize and discuss politics and what needs to be done. It is a space which does not allow, which kind of negotiates its own existence vis-a-vis the factory space, because in factory they can't discuss everything, right? But once they come back to their quarters, the night of the labor is an interesting one. So that's what is also interesting here. So these examining the contexts in which workers lived outside of the workplace could provide meaningful insights. In terms of social intimacy as a concept, for Chandrawaka, this social intimacy, the neighborhood was an arena where the political solidarities of the working class and their social consciousness and social being was actually forged. But it was also a site in which differences, divisions also became manifest, right? And the working class, Chandrawaka has argued in his work, could not be grasped as a single homogeneous identity, as some would make us believe. The worker was not merely a factory proletariat, but had a religious identity as well as a political imagination. That's why they chose to either go with the communist organizations or the Congress Party or with the Muslim League, right? So the neighborhood, this idea of a neighborhood, this arena neighborhood, provided workers with an indispensable base, not only for industrial action, but all other forms of collective action also. And working class collective action did not always remain restricted to factory-related agitation, but often was part of communal clashes guided by sectarian interests. The neighborhood also became an arena of communal conflict and was readily available for degrees of direct action, riot, and this spectacular violence as a direct action. Working class neighborhoods, they imparted a public quality to its social life. And the significance of places like gullies, mohallas, parks, this conflict that I discussed took place in a small park, and then erupted into streets and localities. So these parks and streets are significant here because it imparted its momentum not only to leisure, where workers would hang out and have chai and beedi and play cards, but politics too. And communal politics or sectarian politics as an important part of the working class politics, that what I'm trying to highlight here. And one point I want to add here, and this is the new kind of a discussion that is emerging in the field of crime studies and anthropology and sociology, is about, you talked about this lumpen proletariat and this subnormality. Actually, the discussion now in the last decade is about advanced marginality. People are talking, so people have argued, like, if you look at these big cities of the world, which are economic centers like London, like New York, like Paris, but all of these wealth producing cities have such underbellies, such ghettos and slums. How is it possible that the most wealthiest of the countries and cities, which are economic and financial hubs, have extreme poverty there? Now, I want to kind of, also, because we're talking about the last decade, about arrival of neoliberal politics, but even in colonial times, which is like expropriation, exploitation of the working class and the resources, and in fact, the setup is extractive in nature and exploitative in nature and repressive in nature. But you look at it and you see that, the colonial government argued the city as something as promising, as a utopia, with the will kind of intensify economic activity, would provide jobs, bring development and all of that, would bring the native to the face to face with modernity and capitalism and industry and science and technology. But here, the city is resourceful for the colonial master because it promises so much, and for the working class because who's a peasant who has moved to now city because he wants wages, have no land, and it's a promise of politics for the working class now, which is both working class slash peasantry in various forms. So this underbelly of the colonial city is now erupting with politics in the form of these riots, I would say. But thank you for your questions. Very, very important questions. I have a few more ideas which I'll contemplate further in terms of taking this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Umair Anas, may I go ahead?
Zubair,
Zubair, yeah, Zubair.
please go ahead. Dr. Zubair from Delhi University.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Javed, for a wonderful presentation. And you have provoked several ideas in the mind. I'm sure you have given enough food for thought. Well, I was keenly listening to your presentation, and I want to nudge you towards other directions also, and I want your understanding or your study regarding this. See, generally, what happens is that the working class neighborhoods, beside being organized on the communal lines, we do see that they are also organized on the basis of the caste and as well as on the basis of migration. But most of the people in the cities are the immigrants from different parts of the country. So they are organized in that line on that lines too. So do you see the violence taking place in particular caste localities or particular localities where the people from particular areas are in dominant? So that was one of the things that I wanted. Thank you.
We have one more hand here, Sharif Zia from Delhi University. He is also assistant professor there.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Wani, for an interesting presentation. Was very similar question that Dr. Zubair is asking. You start your presentation with the statement that there is in fact certain kind of ambivalence in the character of neighborhood, but that I think was not really carved out very well, because I feel that there is a similar logic in two kinds of categorization. One that is being done by the administration, the categorization of the Mawali, and the second, the categorization of casual labor that you are doing. So I am not really very clear how these two categorizations are different, because I bring in two kinds of literature. One, obviously, the discussion by Sylvia Vartuk. Obviously, you must be aware of her work in Bombay itself on neighborhoods, where she is really talking about that ambivalence and the multiplicity of identities in and how it plays out. And on larger theoretical level, I take it to the ideas of different kinds of capitals that Bourdieu talks of. And it's not only about the economic capital, which may be responsible for certain kind of identities and the belongingness, but also other kinds of capital which may lead to then intersections of identities, isn't it? And different kind of allegiances and alliances. So if we look at that kind of understanding of neighborhood, and with that understanding of capital, so can we think about this understanding of labor and the criminality of it, as you are trying to reach at, with maybe some another layer of understanding, just trying to insert a layer which makes this space very, very ambiguous, and to law then what it looks like. Because when we are categorizing it and giving it some kind of homogeneity, it becomes very easy for law to look at it in a certain way. But when it becomes very ambiguous, how will law look at it? If law will kind of intervene in the same way as we are looking at it as intervening. Because when you look at this process of decolonization and say that there's a continuation of repressiveness from the colonial to the newly formed government, an important question needs to be understood when we understand law is that can there be an existence of law without force? And force of law is a usual jargon we use, isn't it? So in that sense, we need to break it down more, break down this homogeneity of or the categorization more to understand it. I don't know if I'm making sense or not, but yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your questions, Dr. Zubair and Sharif Zia. But before I kind of respond to your questions in terms of you ended, Sharif, you ended your comment and intrigue with saying if I'm making sense. So I want to first also respond to that and connect it with the opening remarks of Dr. Anas in the beginning. And I find these kind of interactions, everything makes sense. That's the purpose of this conversation for me, at least, this discussion, this platform, or such similar platforms, which politically could be understood as encounters, encounters between me and you and all others who are part of this platform. Today online, tomorrow we might just face each other face to face. And, and it's kind of, it's almost like, as Alan Badiou would call, in his work In Praise of Love, would refer to that. And, he celebrates this difference between why love is significant. Badiou says it's not because two people are interested in each other, just that, but he says that two people are, this interest is political because it is based on difference. So this intellectual kind of, let's say, questioning of each other is also very, what do you say? It's like Badiou is as opposed to Gandhi and Tolstoy, who would argue for a platonic love, or Martin Luther King, who refers to this ancient Greek notion of agape, the kind of love that would cut off the chain of hate between human beings, But in the spirit of Badiouin sense, what you asked me, with a sense of kind of curiosity or some kind of investigation, it has a certain truth enlarging value, an effort to understand me or what I'm trying to convey. And similarly, I would do it for you. So there's a kind of, an intellectual relation which is very precise. But anyways, I'm just blabbering now. I don't want to go into that direction. That will become a philosophy conversation altogether. But anyways, coming back to the question, yes, Dr. Zubair, this caste, as I said at the beginning of because the time is limited for this talk and I cannot go into each and every detail, but of course, caste, religion, and region also were an important part of how the working class in these industrial and port cities would settle. And there's a lot of discussion in modern Indian history about the connections between how the workers from United Provinces would move to Calcutta, how workers from Konkani region, United Provinces, and Hyderabad would come to Bombay, where they would settle. There would also be caste. Of course, caste cannot easily settle into any place, right? So, and then caste cannot also do all kinds of work. So if you look at factories who were doing hide work, for example, in Agra and Kanpur factories, you'll find that this hide for the leather factories, where workers of a particular caste would only be deployed to clean hides, clear hides, and color hides is an important factor. This is, and of course, caste is an important element here. But then at the same time, the moment in history that we're talking about is that everything is in flux at that moment. Election has just happened. Congress, which was the dominant voice, has suddenly had to face elections. And in those elections, the Republican Party, the Labour forces, the Muslim League, and other smaller organizations were constantly challenging their dominant notion of what the election is about. And if you're familiar with the 1937 elections, for many months, Congress actually boycotted the elections. And everybody else was willing to contest the 1937 elections. And then towards the end, when they saw that there's no way out of elections, then Nehru had this great grand convention where they said, we are going to contest the election to wreck the constitution. And by constitution, they mean the 1935 Government of India. So this kind of a context kind of intensified all of these issues. And the interests at these kinds of heightened political moments also become very fragmented and polarized. So yes, there was caste, religion, region, and gender also. For example, if you look at Shamita Sen's work in the jute industry, regarding jute industry in Calcutta, she has very beautifully brought out the gendered aspect, and how the notion of women and the exploitation of women vis-a-vis the notion of the factory, and what other kinds of burden and exploitation happen there. So similarly with Kanpur factories and the question of caste, all of this exists in various kinds of literature. So I hope I have kind of not responded, but just kind of said that I'm aware of this kind of a discussion within history and sociology also, and anthropology also. But given the paucity of time, could not delve further. And also, these concerns might not be like directly relevant to the question that I am dealing with intellectually. Sharif, into your question about ambivalence, when I use the term ambivalence, I'm sorry if I was not clear enough. When I said ambivalence, by ambivalence, I mean like, if you look at a governmental or a public policy perspective of what is a locality, what is a neighborhood, government looks at locality in a very quote unquote what it likes to call scientific. So they will look at street number. It begins with house number, street number, block, county, district, province. These are the definitions with which the state operates. But neighborhood in opposition to these kinds of categorizations of locality and location and place and space, neighborhood becomes an ambiguous because it can, it has that flexibility to deal with all kinds of things. It can be like few houses, can be mohalla, it can be everything. So I was talking more about neighborhood as a having that conceptual ambivalence. And why ambivalence is interesting to me. Interesting, I'm saying it's not. It might not be the only way to look at it. Is because of its potential, its potentiality. The possibility that it opens up in terms of making sense of these spaces, these urban locations. Now, in terms of law, I'm aware of this force of law and the entire debate. Of course, I teach in a law, legal, kind of critical legal studies department. So, law loves to appear definitive, but if you look closely, it is full of ambiguity. And I will very precisely point towards the element of discretion in modern law. So law, section this, subsection this, clause this, all of this is there. But then in certain laws, for example, in section 144, Indian Arms Act, right? Curfews, it doesn't specify certain things. It just says discretion of the district magistrate, of this policeman on that location. It is, we leave it to the discretion. Now, discretion is again ambiguity. Law does not accept its ambiguity. It always wants to appear definitive. But if you look closely towards these, especially to these extraordinary kind of a legislation or laws or rules, you will see that law is ambiguous, and discretion as a tool is important part of that ambivalence, that ambiguity. Now, can there be an existence of law without force? Walter Benjamin, Derrida, the entire discussion about sovereignty, they have touched upon this question. That's not even my question. My question is about what happened. So all of this posturing of nationalism, of decolonization of a particular kind, is what I have an intellectual problem with, which doesn't take responsibility for its own actions. It's easy to blame the other in this context. But what about when it comes to taking responsibility for our own history making on important moments during important moments in history where we could not do any better? That's my concern here. That's the question I want to raise and want to probe further in future. Thank you. I hope I also again made some sense to you.
All right, thank you very much. I must say that I have enjoyed this discussion thoroughly. and must say I have learned many things and many new things, many new perspectives. And I believe that your book, which is coming, is going to create a lot of curiosity and attention among the all disciplines, because it is including many discussions, including communalism and political concepts of nation state. So I think that we have made very good use of our time, and we have benefited, and the purpose of the colloquium has been to a large extent achieved. I'm waiting again for our next colloquium very soon. So thank you very much. Closing here now.